It's been a year, more or less, since the release of Marvel Studios' Disney Plus show Moon Knight, and that's about all I can say definitively about the show, because in that year, a consensus has not formed, and that's a pretty big understatement. Whenever Moon Knight comes up online, it's not so much that people disagree about the show, it's that from the way people talk about Moon Knight, it's almost like there are two shows here, one of which is a successful, even charming adventure series, one which feels unique within this world that delves unflinchingly into its characters, and the other of which is a farce, an over-sanitized, underwhelming waste of potential that goes beyond mere failure and becomes a middle finger to both the viewers and the source material. The objective of this video is to have a go at measuring up each of these imagined Moon Knights against the real one, the 3 or so hours of video hosted on Disney Plus, to establish which one's nearer, and maybe even to attempt some sort of reconciliation. Maybe try to balance Moon Knight's scales. Before we go on to talk about the more abstract concepts at play here, adaptation, representation, before we try to really balance those scales, I think it'd be best to start off a bit closer to the text, to that actual viewable Moon Knight, with a roughly chronological meander through the show, its successes and its failures. So let's do that. The show's first episode is nearer Russian Doll than it is Iron Man.
Get up, gotta get out, gotta get home before...
There's a lot to like about the premiere. Part of the fun of Moon Knight, at least the first time around, comes from the mystery of it all. Viewers struggling alongside Steven to put together the pieces, figure out what's real and what isn't. And as we'll go on to discuss a lot, enough is changed or shuffled around from the Moon Knight comics that on first watch, even the biggest Marc Spector superfan wouldn't have known precisely what was going on. Unsurprisingly, 1 year on rewatch, a lot of this enjoyment is lessened. That slow burn becomes just slow pacing, but seeing Steven try to muddle through his disintegrating life does remain interesting. Part of that's due to Oscar Isaac's performance, again more on that later, but a lot of it's due to the little successes along the way. The slice of life segments are fun enough in their own right, all of the side characters here are well performed too, feel like real people, Donna, the security guard, the woman Steven stands up. It makes us feel the distress of Steven's dissociation alongside him. This isn't just a background, the launching point for a supernatural adventure, it's a life. We're invested in Steven's happiness independently of Marc's. While plenty of viewers, not least myself, felt a little shortchanged by the way the show swerved away from its grittier side, I will say that the snatches of real violence and hurt we see in sequences like the Alpine Scarab escape bit do shock, do add to the twinges of psychological horror we feel alongside Steven. The main reason the show's start holds up on repeated viewings then is the quality of the non-Moon Knight parts of it. The little touches are great, the really solid lines, the stuff like the whole goldfish mystery that didn't really need to be here but just adds an amount of depth. I do think it was a pretty neat idea to begin this show as one alter's dominance over the body is beginning to break down. That'd be a compelling pitch even without the supernatural side of things, but orienting the show around Steven like this does mean Marc, oftentimes the dominant Moon Knight alter, plays a more limited, supportive role, for now at least. The first episode ends with the first real glimpse of our titular hero, and just like every time a new character debuts in one of these projects, there was a vocal glob of internet guys who loudly contended that the design was terrible, and hey, sometimes those guys are right, but sometimes they're wrong. This was one of those times. Moon Knight's design, or designs, the regular suit and the Mr. Knight suit we'd go on to see later, come on, these are great. And the whole mummy theming fits this interpretation of the character, the mythos, perfectly. Would it have been cool to see a more retro suit, some real tactical, I don't know, Kevlar padded thing that Marc would have had to change into? Sure, but for this show, I think what we got was undoubtedly the better fit, weak pun unintended. Plus, it's practical, only touched up with CGI, which is neat. That CGI, both with regard to those suit touch-ups and more widely in the show, is fine, but not flawless. Amit doesn't look great, for instance, but rushed VFX seems to have been a constant throughout Phase 4, so I think it's unhelpful to lay this fault at Moon Knight's feet specifically, and really, there's very few points at which VFX concerns stick out when you're not looking for them, way fewer than in traditional TV. Moreover, any visual weaknesses here are counterbalanced by a more imaginative cinematography than is typical for these projects. Directors Mohamed Diab, Justin Benson, and Aaron Moorhead aren't afraid to have fun with it, to chuck a freeze frame into the mix, for instance, or to devote minutes to episode 4's really imaginative death sequence, which I've gushed about before, albeit in my bad sound quality era. Link on screen now. The first couple of episodes both have Stephen come into contact with the main antagonist, Arthur Harrow, toward their end. And we'll talk more about why I like Harrow, like this performance, like him as a villain for this piece, along with the rest of the show's characters in a few minutes, but the show suggests fairly early on that he's on some moral crusade, a mission to weed out humanity's would-be monsters before they actually do the bad things. When I watched Moon Knight for the first time, as it aired, I was disappointed by the way this quasi-philosophical angle falls apart. You might assume, as I did, that this conflict between Harrow and Amit's style of preventative justice, and Khonshu's post-facto vengeance was supposed to be some grand ethical conundrum that would underpin our story, that the show would really delve into as Amit's freedom drew nearer and nearer, but you'd be wrong. A key moment in this abandonment comes in episode 3, in Harrow's abortive trial. The Ennead acquit Harrow because he hasn't done anything yet, and given the amount of mustard Osiris puts on this verdict, it seems like this is intended to function as a critique of Khonshu's justice, to show the drawbacks of only punishing after the crime.
This is about how dangerous he is, if you will just listen for a second. He has committed no offense. This matter is concluded.
But this scene is nakedly dysfunctional. Khonshu's charge against Harrow is conspiracy to release Amit, so the simple fact that he hasn't freed her yet shouldn't be much of a defense. The first time round, I remember seeing the wider collapse of this seemingly interesting dilemma, and feeling shortchanged, but on rewatch, something clicked. None of these gods really stand for anything. Granted, it is still a little unclear precisely what type of gods these Egyptian deities are in the MCU, whether they're actually somewhat divine manifestations of the attributes they govern, or if they're nearer what they tend to be in the comics these days. Basically, advanced, sort of interdimensional beings who the ancients worshipped as divine. But either way, these gods are not moral beings. This isn't divinity in the VeggieTales sense, where God is good and righteous. This is pagan divinity, Old Testament, vengeful, capricious divinity. Sure, some, like Taweret, seem to take their duties more seriously, but plenty don't. The Ennead have slacked off entirely, and as we see upon Amit's return, they're more than happy to suspend or bend their principles when it suits them. Khonshu claims to stand for vengeance, Amit for preemptive judgment, but we probably shouldn't take their word for it. And watching Moon Knight gets a lot more enjoyable, a lot more coherent, when you realize you're not watching some grand moral conundrum be decided so much as you're watching a bunch of extra-dimensional spirits having a big annoying squabble. A squabble that's dragged in some unfortunate human agents. Anyway, yeah, by the time all this stuff's come to the forefront, we've left London for Cairo, and the show's begun in earnest. Those first episodes had a kinda gothic, horror-light tone. It was set in England, after all, but as we hit the streets of the Egyptian capital, as our characters head into the desert afterward, you start to get an old-school, swashbuckling adventure vibe, in the sort of Tomb Raider vein. Not too self-serious, but never parodic, and it gets harder and harder not to have a good time. You might be thinking that Tomb Raider's an odd reference point for a superhero show, but that's because, well, by this point, it's clear that this isn't really a superhero show. I mean, our hero has superpowers, but that's about as far as it goes. This is more of a fantasy adventure than anything else, nearer Percy Jackson than Spider-Man. We'll talk more about this choice later, but the other thing the Cairo setting brings us is our first real, uninterrupted Marc Spector Moon Knight fight scene. Seeing Moon Knight go ham is a lot of fun, and given those fantasy leanings this show has, I think stuff like the bulletproof cape and the infinite crescent shuriken things are a nice touch. I know a lot of people dislike this sequence because they find the invulnerability conceptually unsatisfying, and I see where they're coming from, but I don't think it's a massive problem personally, because it isn't as though Mark just gets to rampage in God mode all over these goons. While he may have fewer physical limitations in Moon Knight form than similar characters, he's constantly struggling for control of his body. That's where the tension comes from here, and that's what balances things out. Let's not forget, it is a power that can be taken away, something we later see happen. We have seen plenty of similar dynamics elsewhere. For instance, pre-Endgame Hulk is more or less unkillable, but his fight scenes remain interesting, because his obstacles are mental. If he gets too savage or too calm, then that's where the problem arises. Maybe when Moon Knight starts to interact with other heroes, the wider MCU, some balancing issues might crop up, but for now, for this show, that's not really relevant. It does also bear mentioning that even comic book Moon Knight is essentially invincible, what with all the resurrection going on. So all that being said, I think this power set is fine, cool even. There are a few moments here and there which feel cheap, like going with "I'll try spinning," that's a good trick, as the way Marc escapes a seemingly inescapable trap, but if that is a shortcoming, the problem here is in the script or the choreography rather than bound up conceptually with Marc's power set. I don't know, it's still pretty cool though. Increasingly, I don't know, it's still pretty cool though, becomes the motto of the Moon Knight viewer. The show doesn't give you all the answers, but it's tricky to tell when this is intentional and when it isn't. As we discussed a minute ago, the role of the gods is a little muddy here. Who they are, what they stand for. And while you can do what I did, read this as the show throwing out any idea of well-defined, squeaky clean divinity and embracing ambiguity, that is the generous interpretation. What should we make of oddly constructed moments like this one?
We have not abandoned humanity. They abandoned us. We simply trust our avatars to carry out our purposes.
The avatars that remain here are simply meant to observe. We decided long ago we did not wish to meddle in the affairs of man.
Horus claims the gods never abandoned humanity, that humanity abandoned them, then refers to their avatars carrying out the gods' purposes, and seconds later, Osiris claims that avatars are simply meant to observe, and that gods decided long ago not to meddle in the affairs of man. There is a way to resolve this seeming contradiction. Maybe what Horus means is that while gods didn't choose to abandon humanity, the fact humanity abandoned them somehow severed the Ennead from mankind, and that as a result, the gods begrudgingly accepted this new status quo, this being the decision Osiris references. As a result, the purposes Horus claims the avatars carry out are simply observatory in nature, and Horus's claim that the gods never abandoned humans is a half-truth. An abandonment did take place, but not one they had initiated. You could take the scene this way, but that is a fairly tortured reading of a sort of throwaway exchange, so it is hard to justify such a generous interpretation. As a result, in this scene, in these episodes, there's a lot of interesting ambiguity, but in a way that ambiguity is itself ambiguous. Authorial intention isn't particularly important here, that isn't the issue, it's just sometimes hard to get a read on how the show understands itself. Toward the show's second half, though, this ambiguity does start to pay dividends. That aforementioned death sequence in episode 4 gives us some really evocative visuals and leaves the interpretation up to the viewer. Right after, we're in the asylum, then the Duat, and it's never clear precisely where the boundaries of these places are. And this feels intentional. This feels like a channeling of those earlier Moon Knight stories which played pretty hard with the idea that none of this Egypt stuff was real, that it was all in Marc's head. Is the asylum the result of those last few flickering neurons in Marc's brain? Is it somehow metaphysically attached to this afterlife plane? Is all this happening within the heads of post-death Marc and Steven? Some of these possibilities seem more likely than others, but crucially, you're never quite sure, and preserving this uncertainty is a fun move for a franchise that often seems allergic to subtlety. Things stay ambiguous in that much-beloved 5th episode too. The Khonshu-like skeleton in the childhood flashback is a wonderful little touch that'll set alarm bells ringing for anyone who's familiar with a particular chicken and egg dynamic the Moon Knight comics like to mess around with. So maybe what's meant to be ambiguous isn't always clear, maybe this muddiness is a mixed bag, but on balance, I'll take that mixed bag over Marvel's usual straightforward rigidity. There's plenty more to admire in this 5th chapter. Obviously the performances, which we'll talk a little more about soon, the way this episode gives Isaac the only real chance to dig into the Marc role, but also the gut punch of the zombie cafe, and the unflinching, hard-hitting vision of childhood trauma. On less of a bummer note, we also see a spectacular, lavishly realized origin sequence.
Do you swear to protect the travelers of the light and bring my vengeance to those who would do them harm? Then rise. Rise and live again as my fist of vengeance.
It's not a full origin episode, sure, but there's no reason this period of Marc's life couldn't be revisited in the future, and what we got here was a darkly cinematic success. Then, of course, you get to... Oh, I think my big, weighty issues detector is sounding. Let's hold off on that for now. We will be opening that can of worms along with other cans full of other worms, but not just yet. How about some finale talk? Despite some amount of pacing whiplash, a slow burner of the series gets wrapped up in what was, what if aside, the shortest MCU Disney Plus finale to date. This is one of the phase's better finales. There's genuinely a lot to love here. Gods smacking each other silly in front of the pyramids is a great time for the franchise's first kaiju fight. There's some of the best choreography yet, and seeing Marc and Steven's new bond in action is satisfying as heck. It's certainly not perfect, though. Amit's CG doesn't match up to Khonshu, I'm convinced this final asylum scene is in the wrong place, and the decision to have Harrow's final defeat happen off-screen is a real head-scratcher. I did talk a little about this whole thing in a previous video, so I'll link that now, but that dissociation effect, awesome. Using it to build up the Jake mystery throughout the season, shame about the missing action scenes, I guess, but cool idea. Using it to skip the final showdown, sidestepping a sequence where Marc and Steven have to work together, get to show Harrow he was wrong about their weakness before reaching a cathartic triumph, and then not addressing this Jake mystery until the post-credit scene, kicking all that setup down the road, truly a wild decision. If you can look past this though, I like the balance of conclusion and open-endedness we see here. Enough is wrapped up here that the character's next appearance could be anything, could go anywhere, and we'll come back to this reset potential later on. So that's the season. But how much of a season is it exactly? At first, Moon Knight does seem to be, broadly speaking, another example of that elongated movie television format that Marvel seems to favor on Disney+, but there are a few ways in which it embraces the TV format better than some of its predecessors. For one, perhaps by virtue of this show's geographical mobility, the episodes do feel more separate. I also like the way episode 2 opens abruptly with a return to Steven's cycle of violent waking up we'd seen throughout episode 1, and this does toss just a pinch of ambiguity, of was it all a dream, into the mix to preserve the slightly unreal feeling of these London episodes. If you're going to tell one ongoing story in a series like this, aside from the extra runtime, the only real difference between that and, you know, a movie is the fact that your story's punctuated with ends and beginnings, and I like that Moon Knight actually recognizes and uses that to do something, even if it's a small thing that only happens once. But yeah, that is the season, and if at this point it seems like we're really no nearer to balancing those scales, reconciling the Moon Knight's great crowd with the this show killed my family with a pipe wrench crowd, if it still seems like this is just a show, a pretty good time with some highlights and some problems, then yes, you've been paying attention, so I guess it's time to head deeper. A major point of contention here is character. Who these guys are, how they're performed, how prominent they are or aren't, and how many liberties have been taken with their comic book inspirations. Fans cite deep, convincing, and empathetic character work as key here. Critics tend to hone in on Marc's alters as particular low points, but I don't think even the show's harshest critic would deny that Oscar Isaac's performances here are impressive, and almost always very successful. However you feel about this show's take on Marc, Steven, and Jake, this whole project lives or dies on the strength and confidence of the multi-rolling, and Isaac does not disappoint. He's got a lot to do here, some really heavy lifting, and a lot of the time he's required to act against himself. And even if you've got a relative to help you out, that can't be easy. One touch in particular I'm rather fond of is Steven's accent and dialect.
It's alright, I don't mean that in like a creepy way.
No, I'm sorry, I'm not buying this, Mark.
use whatever accent you want.
He almost sounds like a Londoner, close enough that I'm betting a lot of non-Brits watching assumed it was perfect. But as I suggested in a video last year, back when the show was dropping, it's just off enough, containing just enough weird intonation and odd word choice to make it clear to anyone who knows what they're listening for that something is wrong here. Isaac has since confirmed that this was a conscious choice, that the accent wasn't bad by accident, that it was unconvincing on purpose, an early indication to unknowing viewers that maybe Steven's life wasn't quite what it seemed. So as a real accent, not great, but as the accent of an American-born man's English alter, one who's only lived in the country for a matter of months, whose speaking patterns were based primarily on hokey B-movie dialogue, it's amazing. Outside of Isaac's performance though, things start to get messy here. This is one of those points where the scales don't balance, where that singular Moon Knight ceases to exist, replaced by disagreements and crosstalk. There are two Stevens. One is endearing, a much-needed source of levity, a grounding presence, the show's heart, and the other is a bad joke, an annoying idiot, a squandering of the source material's potential. I do think, zoomed out, the change from rich playboy Stephen Grant to British gift shoppist Stephen Grant is a lateral one at best, that it may well limit what type of Moon Knight stories the MCU will be able to tell, and that while turning this third of Moon Knight into a wannabe Egyptophile is conceptually interesting, it isn't necessarily more interesting than the doors, both narrative and psychological, that a more comic booky Stephen Alter could have opened up. Barring this project being a The Batman-style standalone though, I do think something like this was always going to happen. Moon Knight's often been compared to Batman, and that's a silly comparison to make, obviously, but it's not utterly baseless. Rich playboy splitting his time between a mansion and a caped crusade against crime, you can see why Stephen Grant and Bruce Wayne are perceived as similar figures, and of the two, the latter's pop cultural footprint is, well, a little bigger. One habit the MCU's always had is that drive to avoid repeating things from elsewhere in superhero cinema. In an interview, Moon Knight writer Jeremy Slater said of Kevin Feige, he's not only always looking for that number one thing Marvel hasn't done yet, but also what the competition hasn't done. And I think this has been visible from the very start of the franchise. Even back in 2007, big screen secret identity drama was getting played out. Cool, Iron Man goes public. It's only become more obvious since then. We've already had 2 Spider-Man origin stories on screen in the past 20 years, we'll skip it entirely. The public's seen enough X-Men films to know the general mutant conceit, well, we'll just start sprinkling them in, with nary an explanation. And sometimes we'll literally just use those guys from the other films. The first MCU appearance of a Fantastic Four member wasn't accompanied by any sort of organic origin story. Multiverse of Madness just brought him out like hologram Tupac at Coachella. For better or for worse, this is a dynamic the franchise has always had, to one degree or another, and given Batman's continued relevance, I really have a hard time picturing any hypothetical different MCU version of Moon Knight that wouldn't have significantly changed Stephen Grant. And if this is true, this Stephen's probably as good a replacement as any, especially because if you zoom back in, start looking once more at the story the show actually went with, and Stephen's role within it, it all ends up working pretty well. Do I love the way he seems to be permanently concussed? Not really, but A, the more childlike mentality we see does make sense given the Alter's origins in episode 5, and B, there's really no reason to assume Stephen won't change and grow going forward, especially since, for maybe the first time in their lives, he and Mark seem to have reached a relatively healthy equilibrium by the season's end, and by episode 6, after the viewer's been introduced to the world, the lore, the rules, and this little chapter of their lives has wrapped up, this section of the story is over, leaving the character's future a nearly blank slate, heavy with possibility. Again, we'll discuss this more later, but the print version of this character and his world has changed a lot over the years, and I don't think there's any reason to assume that the live-action Moon Knight won't also change, especially bearing in mind the significant pivots other MCU mainstays like Thor or Hulk have seen across the past decade or so. Whatever else these 6 episodes may be, they do conclude in a fairly open-ended way. Aside from the Jake Lockley question, the stage is more or less cleared for whichever way the next set of creatives want to take the character. After a time jump, after more time spent in the world, we may well return to a more mature, worldly Stephen. Even a Stephen nearer to that of the comics, a Stephen who's parlayed his obvious intelligence into financial success and developed some high society contacts. Going forward, this reset potential offered by the show's close also positions the Marc character in an exciting place. The emphasis these episodes placed on Steven as opposed to Marc did result in the latter character, typically the dominant Moon Knight alter, getting less time to shine, less development than many were hoping for. And as it stands, barring the mustard he puts on Marc's freak-out moments, this version of the character does come across more or less as Oscar Isaac's default action hero persona. But I do think this emphasis is the result of this story, and that any one of Moon Knight's alters can and probably will become the focal point, the main perspective character in other projects down the line. There's some seemingly reliable chatter that Moon Knight might make it onto an Avengers squad at some point soon, and if this is the case, I'd expect to see a lot more of Marc in that environment than anyone else. I understand that some longtime fans of the character may have felt jilted by the direction this show took Marc, Steven, and Jake in, but this is just the beginning for Moon Knight. Everyone involved clearly feels very passionately about the character, so we will be seeing more of him. And if nothing else, the Disney Plus show does end in a way that leaves the door open to really any number of future possibilities. This reset potential goes well beyond characterization. But keep that in mind, and we'll come back to it in like 40 minutes. Let's finish the triad. Jake Lockley, Moon Knight's third major alter, doesn't get much time to shine here. Despite exerting a not insignificant impact on the overall series, as we discussed a minute ago, he has only a few seconds on screen, but I do like the take on Jake we eventually see. There's been some behind-the-scenes talk about the fact that at various points, a more balanced dynamic, giving Jake a similar amount of visible presence as Marc and Steven, was attempted, but that it never really worked. Jake as the nasty guy, the guy doing the ugly stuff that Marc and Steven don't need to know about, is a dynamic that the comics have played with now and then, so it's not like they pulled this out of thin air, and if the people who made this are saying that trial and error proved this general Jake dynamic was the best fit here, I'm not going to doubt them. Whether they executed that idea perfectly, whether he should have popped up before the post-credits scene is another question, but I really don't see much wrong with relegating Jake to the background during the Moon Knight character's introduction. And I do really like Isaac's take on Jake too. We only see Lockley for one scene, a handful of seconds, but even then he is clearly distinct. Isaac differentiates himself physically and vocally once again. And on that note, just briefly, Jake speaks Spanish, and no, that isn't a big deal. This is hardly some massive change, and honestly, I think it adds a pretty cool layer to this character. One cool part of the whole traditional Moon Knight deal is the way Marc and his alters allow for stories to cut across social strata, from Steven's mansions and boardrooms to the view from below, seen through the windscreen of Lockley's taxicab. We lose some of this with the MCU's different take on Steven, it's true, but I think Jake as Spanish adds a really interesting new dimension here. For one, in 2022, in the global north, the sort of urban, working, underclass spaces the Lockley of the 80s thrived in, it'd be a lot easier and perhaps truer to explore those with the minority experience in mind. More to the point though, this was a change made by Isaac. Reportedly, he was very enthusiastic about bringing some of his own identity to this role. The fun of adaptation is often seeing how the source material combines with a new, different set of artistic impulses, and to some degree, on-screen characters are always a synthesis of script and actor, are always produced in the interplay of page and performer. To me, that's what we're seeing here. But even if that doesn't interest you, even if the new readings it allows for don't either, isn't it cool that a respected character actor took this role, cared enough about it to bring a part of his own Guatemalan experience to it? And if nothing else, isn't the language Jake Lockley speaks, not who he is, not what he does, not what he says, just the way in which he says it, a worthy price to pay for the Moon Knight actor being that bit more enthusiastic about Moon Knight? And speaking of enthusiastic actors, Ethan Hawke turns in a really great performance as Arthur Harrow here too. Hawke's very successful in giving us this tortured, ghoulish cult leader, who you can just about tell isn't all there. I do like this character as the villain here, primarily because of the interplay between him and our protagonists. Broadly speaking, Marc and Steven's journey here is a journey away from self-deception and toward acceptance. That's the arc. That's what we see all throughout these episodes. The initial problems, the way Marc increasingly disturbs Steven's life and vice versa, grow and grow until cooperation begins to resolve them. First temporarily, but as the show develops, this cooperation grows less and less conditional. the decoding sequence in episode 3, the tomb ambush next time round. These examples see a level of trust develop between the alters, and episode 5 sees Marc and Steven barred from progressing until they're honest with themselves and each other. The actual physical victory over Harrow doesn't quite fit the pattern, which, yeah, chalk that up to the unsatisfying conclusion of the Jake stuff, but all the little victories we'd seen along the way, in that episode and beforehand, these only come to pass as Marc and Steven stop rejecting each other, stop clinging to the falsehood that they're independent, accept each other's existence and begin to reconcile. On the other hand, Harrow is seemingly unable to question himself or reevaluate. To begin with, he seems intelligent, with total belief in his own vision, and plenty of pre-prepared arguments at the ready to facts and logic his way out of criticism, but soon enough the facade of rationality falls away. By the end, we see that the only thing Harrow believes in more than his own vision is belief itself.
Your scales lack balance.
I understand. I had hoped my penance might correct my imbalance, but I see now that's impossible.
Serve me, and you will find peace.
As you wish.
When Amit is freed, when her changing desires and demands seem to contradict Harrow's own beliefs and actions, he submits right away, serving Amit and the completion of his scheme, this vague crusade for an ill-defined and, as we see, entirely malleable justice, supersedes the nitty-gritty of what this justice is and how it's reached. To pit this bad faith healer against a Marc-Steven duo intent on coming to terms with reality then is a smart move, a move which results in an intensely watchable dynamic, and this is no accident. Hawke and Isaac reportedly worked together to develop this interplay and some specifics of Harrow's characterization, so while there isn't that sharp, well-defined philosophical opposition between Harrow and our heroes, there's enough else going on here to pick up the slack. That isn't to say Harrow's one of Marvel's best villains, he isn't, not really, but he kind of doesn't have to be. There are enough other opposing forces at play here, Amit, the Ennead, even Khonshu, Lockley too, that the main villain not being some larger-than-life figure doesn't result in some vacuum of antagonism. Marc's facing enough here that Harrow can just be a slimy, self-deluding zealot, a foil to Marc, and that's enough. Moving on to the other big thorn in Marc's side, Khonshu might be a bit of a bad guy at times, but he looks great. Yes, the CG in this show can be patchy at times, but Khonshu never looks anything less than amazing, and I think that's important, that he looks as real, haunting, striking, and unnerving to the viewer as he does to Steven in those first appearances. F. Murray Abraham's voice work matches this stark appearance perfectly. The performance has a darkly regal tenor, it's proud and authoritative, but almost to a delusional level. Every now and then though, those delusions of grandeur fall away, and just for a second, Abraham lets Khonshu accept his age, his diminished position.
I remember that night. I remember every night.
Special mention should also go to May Kalamaui as Layla. Kalamawi's newer to projects of this scope than her co-stars in Isaac and Hawke, but absolutely holds her own on screen. At times you can almost sense this greenness, but I don't mean that in a bad way. There's just a sense in which Layla feels more real, less performed than Steven, Marc, or Harrow, and regardless of how intentional this was, it helps ground this character in a world of maniacal cultists and dead pigeon gods. Layla is an interesting composite of a bunch of comic book figures, and Kalamawi's more than able to balance the louder ends of the resulting character with the more delicate, understated stuff we're given in episode 2, for instance. The result is a captivating and often scene-stealing character who adds a lot to the show, and who also doubles as a really cool example of Phase 4's tendency toward well-executed representation. Oh bother, looks like I finally hit a big heavy topic. Well, no use trying to avoid them any longer, I suppose. It's going to be worth bearing in mind for the next few minutes, as we discuss DID, Jewish identity, and Middle Eastern representation, that I am a white British Gentile. My opinions and my assessment here are informed by other, more directly connected voices, but all the same, my perspectives here are probably going to be worth a good deal less than some others. Moon Knight is a slick, often comedic show about a superpowered character with DID, or dissociative identity disorder, for whom this condition is both a help and a hindrance. It's also a show about a Jewish American man serving, to a point controlled by, an Egyptian god, and if you're at all familiar with either Exodus or modern Middle Eastern politics, you'll see that this is somewhat fraught ground. It's a project very eager to bring Egypt and Egyptian people to international audiences in a positive, authentic way, but one that seems less interested in devoting its time to the Jewish side of the character. All these are contentious areas, and many tend to be brought up critically in more negative responses to the show. Is that always warranted, though? Let's start with DID. DID doesn't tend to be a condition that the wider neurotypical public knows much about, and it's not something that the medical world has entirely figured out either, so the lack of a clear viewer consensus here isn't exactly shocking, but as far as I can tell, the show gets a fair amount right here. For one, DID usually develops in children suffering long-term trauma, so the show's vision of this disorder's genesis is a more medically accurate one than the current comic book canons. Yes, the show diverges from aspects of comic book Marc's mental issues, but that might not be a bad thing. The thing to remember here is that comic book Marc's DID is sort of a retcon. The first time we see Marc, there's nothing to suggest he has any mental condition, and even after we go on to meet Steven and Jake in Marvel Spotlight 28, the switches do appear to be a conscious choice. Doug Munch and Don Perlin, the character's creators, weren't doctors or psychologists. Doug was a writer and Don an artist, and together they created an interesting, unique hero, without worrying too hard about how well-defined or realistic that character's mental state was. Sometimes it seems like these personas are fictions Marc's consciously created, sometimes it doesn't, but generally what we see between the character's early years and more recent times, as the comic book medium became more sensitive to responsible depictions of conditions like this, is a gradual process of refinement and readjustment to fit existing elements into a more accurately portrayed, specifically DID condition. On balance then, creating a new take on Marc's childhood, the origins of his DID, one that lines up more closely with the science than anything on the page, that's surely a point in the show's favor. Moving beyond the origins, towards the day-to-day of DID, there's also some good stuff here. I remember chatting to a user in my Discord server who has DID about the show's depiction, and their general takeaway was that while the condition was Hollywoodized a bit, the fundamentals weren't bad at all. The whole mirrors as Skyping with your alters idea is obviously not how it works, but alters can and do talk to each other, and visualizing it like this wasn't a bad way of translating an internal experience into the language of the screen. The viewer even highlighted the 1,000-yard stare dissociation in episode 3 as a pretty bang-on representation of what it feels like to switch. This isn't coincidental. The show consulted with DID experts, and it does seem like for a lot of people that effort paid off. Another viewer of mine with DID wrote in a comment, "We consider Moon Knight very good representation." It also seems to me that Moon Knight is thinking hard about how best to respectively portray Marc's condition throughout. Episode 5 springs to mind. The way Taweret acknowledges both Marc and Steven, the way they both possess these spectral hearts, can be read as the MCU affirming the validity of their experience on a metaphysical level. That being said, I don't want to suggest there's some sort of DID community consensus that this show's good and fine. It's worth mentioning I'm also aware of another viewer of mine with DID who found the Moon Knight show to be an immensely unpleasant and triggering experience. But all I can say is that when hearing from people who have DID themselves, rather than critics of the show citing DID as a problem with it, that type of negativity has not been the norm. But of course, Marc's unique position in this world isn't purely a result of his DID. It also comes from the fact that he's currently, I think, the only prominent Jewish character in the MCU. And audiences have definitely had a more mixed reaction to the way Moon Knight handled this facet of Marc's identity. So yeah, let's get into that. I did talk about this aspect of the show once before, in a video specifically on the minimal Jewish representation in the MCU, and my basic takeaway then was that despite this side of things not getting too much time in the spotlight, the Shiva sequence is a powerful one which succeeds in making Marc's Jewish identity really matter here. I think that the inclusion of Marc's Jewish identity in the Disney Plus series is significant enough to warrant at least some faint praise, because even though the visual markers of this identity are only on screen for like a minute or less in episode 5, it's a pivotal scene. Marc's dissociation comes at his mother's Shiva. In many ways, this is the inciting incident for the show, and for these developments in Marc/Steven's character and life. And the shot of Marc tearing off his yarmulke in a mixture of grief, trauma, and rage page, that's a pretty important moment, symbolically speaking. In a sense, we're seeing Marc tear his identity from his body, as it's shortly afterwards that Stephen pops up for the first time in a long while. The fact that this psychological break is expressed and communicated to us via the cultural artifacts of Marc's Judaism is immensely interesting. If the, quote, benign effacement of Jewish identity in comic book media we discussed earlier can be understood as writers, producers, and directors viewing the Jewish identity as an inessential character trait, a reasonable aspect not to bring over from page to screen during the adaptation process, then I think this Moon Knight moment shows the MCU fixing this attitude, and realizing that the Jewish identities of these characters can be an opportunity, a vehicle for authentic exploration and character moments. And I get that people felt this solitary moment was too small a gesture, I do, but I don't think anyone would have had a problem with the representation in this show if it hadn't been so severely lacking in the MCU before this point. That suggests, to me at least, that the issue isn't with the show, the text itself, but with its context. And if that's the case, shouldn't we view this as a step forward, however slight? There you go, that kind of thing. A year on, although there is more nuance to get into, and we will get into it, I think I broadly stick by that take, and honestly, there is more here than I'd realized back then. It's also worth noting that there are Jewish voices praising the approach Moon Knight took, not just, me. A Screen Rant article written by Adam Fellman, linked in the description, lays out a markedly positive reading of Moon Knight's Jewish side. Fellman writes, "For Jewish viewers like myself, Moon Knight used the emotional beats of our traditions without making them the story's focus." In episode 5, Fellman contends, the Jewish touches are there to show the tranquility, community, and reflection that Marc is missing out on, not to illustrate Jewish history. It's a beautiful, nuanced character touch. Perhaps it is a more distanced approach to involving Judaism in Marc's character, but it's still one with resonant results, Fellman argues. Moreover, for Fellman, this distanced approach, together with the casting of a merely Jewish-descended actor in Isaac, also scans because the Marvel Comics Moon Knight wasn't originally written to tell a story with Judaism at its core. And that last bit is a point I've seen made in my comment sections before, albeit in different words, also by Jewish viewers. Doug Munch apparently took the name Marc Spector from a colleague, only realizing the name was Jewish years later, and almost a decade had passed from the character's debut before the comics actually made something of that link, that being the Alan Zelenet's penned story about the passing of Marc's rabbi father and the Spector's history of anti-Semitic abuse. Many of you, even non-Moon Knight readers, may well have seen these panels before. Ever since the series came out, posts criticizing or calling the show out for ignoring this section of Marc's life have circulated, but few of them seem to be aware of the fact that even in the comics, this episode isn't currently Moon Knight canon. In the past decade or so, Marc's history has been revised, and while there was nothing stopping MCU Moon Knight creator Jeremy Slater and his fellow creatives from drawing on older stories, the reason this version of Marc's past didn't make it to the MCU has as much to do with chronology as anything else. Marc's Jewish father fleeing Czechoslovakia made sense in the 80s, but not so much 40 years later. So while one day seeing an on-screen story inspired by these issues would undoubtedly be awesome, framing the fact that we haven't yet as a simple betrayal of the source material is, well, misleading. Of course, this isn't the only time the comics have focused on Marc's Jewishness, and it isn't the only time that Jewishness has been integrated into the character's origins. Post-retcon, the story is that young Marc was close with a rabbi, this time a family friend, until it turned out that this rabbi was actually the guy who created Red Skull, an ageless Nazi super scientist called Ernst, who spent his time murdering Jewish people. Even if you were to look past the understandable objections some Jewish voices have raised to this new origin, Moon Knight would have had to be a substantially different show for this Ernst episode to fit in, either narratively or tonally. Instead, we got the shiver scenes, but I think episode 5 does see the show in its own way pay respect to this side of the source material. Even in that first real glimpse at Marc's Jewish background way back in 1984, it's clear that it is really this, a Jewish background that Marc wasn't practicing or particularly connected to his heritage on a day-to-day basis. That isn't to say it's unimportant, more that its importance is deeper than it is wide, and while perhaps psychologically present throughout Marc's life, is really most visible in his childhood. We see that in the show. And maybe if the wider MCU before this point had been more concerned with this type of representation, had omitted less of its source material's wider Jewishness, we'd look at Moon Knight and see that despite a lack of runtime dedicated to Mark's Jewish background, it does have a real impact, and that this impact too is deeper than it is wide. Of course, just because his Jewishness wasn't more visible in the comics doesn't mean it shouldn't have been heightened in this version of the character. Perhaps it should, but it does mean that there's not too much of a comic book accuracy argument for a lack of runtime dedicated to Mark's Jewishness. So on balance, I don't see the show's treatment of Mark's Jewish background as a major deviation from the source material or as a failure on its own terms. Maybe there could have been more, but maybe there will be. We are, after all, comparing nearly 50 years of comics to 6 episodes of TV. Holding this character's first appearance up against what comic book writers would do years, decades down the line is probably an unrealistic standard. All that being said, it's all well and good me saying all this, explaining away criticisms, telling you that these changes and choices make sense, but at the end of the day, it isn't really up to me to decide whether the balance was right, whether this was respectful, authentic enough. And sure, some Jewish viewers seem to feel the same way as me, but plenty don't. I can bang on all day long about what I think, but that doesn't begin to negate the failure a lot of people nearer to the topic felt. So while I'm willing to get lightly grazed on the hill that this isn't the naked failing a lot of online voices would have you believe, clearly something isn't right here. Maybe that has to do with our next topic. Maybe the balance between the two wasn't quite fair. You see what I did there? It's a pun. Because, of course, the show's limited Jewish focus doesn't exist in isolation. The Moon Knight show does embrace representation, does champion a rarely championed culture, it's just Egyptian instead. For any newborn babies watching this video, here's some context. Nearly 3,500 years ago, the Israelites, the predecessors of today's Jewish population, had been enslaved by the Egyptians and generally treated, let's say, badly, until eventually, led by Moses, after a prolonged period of struggle and suffering, the Israelites bust out and start hanging out in Canaan instead. That's how the story goes, anyway. The scholarly consensus is that it probably didn't really happen, at least not remotely like this, but that's beside the point. The important part here is that this became the founding myth for the Israelite people, and in the millennia since, the idea of this conflict, this escape from Egyptian servitude, has remained of utmost importance to Jewish religion and culture. That's not all. Nowadays, of course, the nascent Israeli state is right next to Egypt, and because of a number of events that have happened since ancient times, today's Egypt is quite aligned culturally and geopolitically with the rest of the Arabic world. Needless to say, this means that modern Egypt and modern Israel aren't best buddies, owing to the series of scars of British colonialism leading up to the Kippur War, which, of course, since an increasingly hawkish stance. So in conclusion, while to equate the Jewish identity with the Israeli state would be a mistake, for many, the Jewish and Egyptian cultures are still painfully interlinked, and this fraught ground is not some half-remembered historical curiosity, but a spot which remains sore. So where's Moon Knight in all this? Well, everywhere. There's a complex interlocking of Egyptian and Jewish cultures and influences behind this character, and there has been for decades. Since 1980's Moon Knight #1 saw the supernatural side of this character locked in. Marc Spector is a Jewish man serving an Egyptian god. Often this servitude is less than voluntary, and it seems like he can never truly escape this grasp. As a result, the character exists in a prickly, paradoxical state. Not only does this character split between two worlds directly echo a traumatic narrative central to his cultural background, to the cultural backgrounds of many audience members, in many ways this split is the character, is at the very center of today's Moon Knight. And this was never the plan. As noted above, Marc Spector's Jewish background developed sort of accidentally, and the Egyptian mythological side of Moon Knight initially grew in a similarly incremental way. That being said, over the years, and increasingly in recent times, efforts have been made in the comics to make the most of this messy situation, to dig into what the historical baggage of these clashing cultures means for Mark and his alters. Engaging thematic lemonade has been made of these accidental lemons, and in the process, that prickly paradox was worked through. Not often in the grand scheme of things, maybe not always perfectly, but it was done. But that never happened in the show. There was no moment, however brief, of Mark, or Steven for that matter, wrestling with or working through the contradictions and tensions of his identity and role. Indeed, for many, the perception is that the Moon Knight show did the opposite, in choosing to develop a Moon Knight show which took the character out of New York, out of the Grant Mansion, and into the streets of Cairo, one which put Egypt and Egyptians firmly in the spotlight. In failing to resolve or even recognize the tension between these two often conflicting sides, the show privileged one above the other. Especially given the much publicized involvement of Egyptian and Arabic creative voices, the way this side of the show and of Mark's identity seems to have crowded out the Jewish aspects has prompted criticism. I think some of this is well-founded, particularly the idea that some time should have been spent at least acknowledging the tension here, and that it's entirely fair for viewers to feel slighted or shortchanged as a result of this just not happening. But I do think the issue here is more complex than the problematic overemphasis on Egypt that it's sometimes painted as. The problem of the unaddressed Egyptian-Jewish conflict in Moon Knight is often approached from the Jewish perspective, as an instance of these live-action adaptations abandoning or downplaying the more visible markers of the comic book medium's essential Jewishness, but that is, of course, not the only angle we need to think about here. Because you know who else doesn't get much of a look in when it comes to cinematic representation? Who else is shoved out of Hollywood projects based on their own culture? Egyptians. The myths and legends of ancient Egypt, the history of the ancient kingdoms, their downfall, their conquering, and the stories of adventurers, archaeologists, Brendan Fraser's bumbling around in the aftermath have become so familiar, so ingrained in popular culture that it's easy to forget they're not some universal fantasy, that cinema and Western fiction more widely has been taking the cultural legacy of a specific place, a specific people, and rarely doing so in a responsible, sensitive way, rarely involving the actual Egyptians of today in these depictions. And if we're honest with ourselves, didn't Moon Knight, the Moon Knight of the 80s, kind of fall into this category? Americans, writing an American who goes adventuring in a seemingly primitive land, who fights off amoral, opportunistic natives, and gets chosen by an ancient exotic deity? Look, obviously I'm not trying to cancel Moon Knight. The point here isn't to cordon off other spaces, peoples, and lifeways entirely, to suggest that writers from one place need to just stay in their lane. If the goal was to outlaw every little bit of cultural cross-pollination, we'd lose most things worth reading. But there is undoubtedly value in approaching other cultures alongside people from those cultures. And that's what this show's done. Egypt, the space, the culture, the history is intertwined with this character, and the Disney Plus show embraced this. One of the show's directors, Mohamed Diab, has spoken about the lengths the Moon Knight team went to here to cast actors from the culture, to feature Egyptian music, both contemporary tracks and classic ones, and to even recreate Cairo on set, to show Egypt as an urban space, not just the space around the pyramids. And the response to all this was almost entirely positive. Whatever else it is, Moon Knight is kick-ass Egyptian and Arabic representation, is a big screen affirmation of a population who have often historically been distorted and victimized by imperialist nations and their cultures. The garbled backgrounds, tropes, and histories which gave this character that romantic, magical edge have finally, belatedly made it to the foreground, straightened out. And to pick up where we left off when that big heavy topic alarm went off, all this is visible in May Kalamawi's Layla. That's the moment that made 1,000 crusty white guys whinge about Moon Knight's pandering and wokeness. But here's the thing. Don't care, couldn't care less, that's absolutely how an Egyptian kid born in the MCU would react here. This moment, as well as what it represents, very cool. And a welcome corrective to the Fist of Khonshu's overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly Western history. And the awe and raw recognition we saw in that kid on screen was mirrored by plenty of onlookers in our own world. After the finale aired, Diab himself tweeted about his daughter's reaction to seeing a woman who looked like her, with natural, curly hair on screen. And if you're cold to that, if you're so deep into some anti-woke, anti-the message rabbit hole that you can't appreciate the joy of a child, then you're probably just a bit of a loser. But what makes this amazing is that it isn't some invention foreign to Moon Knight's history. It's taking what was already there and just reimagining it from an Egyptian perspective, because Layla isn't an original character, not really. She's Marlene. For those of you who aren't over familiar with the Moon Knight books, Marlene Allran was the daughter of Peter Allran, an archaeologist killed by Bushmen on the mission that had turned Marc Spector from a soldier of fortune to Khonshu's main man. Marlene is the nearest thing Moon Knight has to a Mary Jane, or a Lois Lane, his on-again, off-again long-term partner, both in the field and otherwise, and she very clearly forms the basis for this show's Layla character, all the way down to the surprise reveal that she's married to an alter, a marriage the audience isn't aware of. Layla is the core of Marlene, repackaged into a figure from within this culture, and this is neat. In recasting the archaeologist and his adventuring, Moon Knight partnering daughter as Egyptian themselves, this origin, their role, these become more compelling, more real, charged with and even resisting that ongoing struggle over land, nation, and identity between the Middle East and the West. People have criticized how focal Egypt and the Arabic world were in this show, often holding this focus up against the comparatively little time given to Mark's Jewish background, but really? I think getting this right, giving this time, was just as important. And since the comic's employment of Egyptian myth, heritage, iconography, and so forth is so common, since Egypt was always there but not really, I can't really fault the balance the show gave us either. So while I'm sure some will disagree, and while I'm eager to hear contrasting opinions, counter-arguments in the comments below, after a couple of watches, after a while seeking out other voices and other takes, and after just a year of this show marinating in my brain, this is where I'm at. Maybe we could have done with some time spent digging into what these two clashing identities mean for Moon Knight. Maybe it is a problem that we haven't seen this, so far at least. But aside from this, I do think the show generally succeeded in navigating this minefield of sensitive issues. Jewish American man with DID embroiled in a sticky, loaded relationship with a fantastical, distorted Egypt, a relationship cooked up and developed almost exclusively by Westerners, all this happening in often contradictory ways across decades. This was always going to be a nightmare to pull together, to synthesize into one thing, one story that felt respectful to both the source material and the various cultures and experiences that source material haphazardly drew from. And even if there is still a long way to go in squaring some of these elements with each other, even if we are missing those moments of reconciliation, we have only had 6 episodes. It's easy to forget that it took decades worth of stories for the comic books to get to this point. Maybe this isn't a blind spot, so much as it is the show's creatives wanting to avoid rushing it, cramming it in for the sake of it, wanting to give a future, less cramped, non-introductory Moon Knight project a chance to get into it properly. Even beyond those weightier topics, I really think that last point is key here. The imbalance between the handful of episodes we've had so far and the vastness of the Moon Knight mythos. So many criticisms of the show are rooted here. So many parts of that vision of Moon Knight as unmitigated failure come back again and again to what it left out from the comics, and I just don't think that's fair. For one, because again, what's clearly just a beginning for live-action Moon Knight is being compared to decades of comics, but also, the contention that this is an inaccurate adaptation suggests that an accurate adaptation was possible, and I'm not convinced this is the case. If you disagree, if you think I'm making excuses for the MCU, you know what, go ahead. You've got 1 season, 6 episodes to create a faithful adaptation. Which Moon Knight would you have adapted? The original Moon Knight, the unremarkable mercenary hired by and outfitted by the committee? Clad in and armed with silver by them in order to beat up a werewolf? Or do you want the Moon Knight where Jake and Steven are adopted personas, not real alters? The version of Steven who's inhabited by the spirit of an Egyptian priest? The version of Mark whose alters include Spider-Man and Wolverine? Cyborg sidekick Moon Knight? I could go on. A while back, I referenced the whole Moon Knight deal, invoking the general status quo of this character, but this is something of a convenient fiction. If you listened uncritically to the loudest among the anti-Moon Knight YouTube commenters and Twitter swarms, the comic book accuracy brigade, you might be shocked to learn that Mr. Knight first appeared in 2014, and that just 2 years later he was already being utilized in wider ways than simply Mark's intelligence-gathering Moon Knight disguise, or to learn that Ultimate Universe Universe's Moon Knight was more Stephen Grant than Marc Spector, that the same's often been true in 616. Let's not forget the aforementioned fact that for the majority of the character's existence, the treatment of his mental situation was anything but consistent, and was a lot less researched or sensitive than what we saw on Disney+, with explanations varying from DID to schizophrenia to outright brain damage, and yes, the idea that Mark was just playing pretend all along. None of this is to hand-wave away the fact that the show does divert, often in major ways, from familiar aspects of the source material, but the issue really isn't as clear-cut as it's often made to be. A lot of the most critical comparisons seem to have been made between the show on one hand and this convenient fiction, this pulling together of various periods and ideas into a semi-imaginary stable Moon Knight status quo, when they should have been made between the show and the comics as they are, an ongoing, ever-changing, protean, fragmentary collection of stories spanning several decades, often fantastic, but never fully cohesive, never some simple, unitary thing that could straightforwardly, unproblematically be adapted into a Disney Plus show. No, really, the best you could do here is pick one or two of comic book Moon Knight's various, concepts, eras, and focus on those. And that's pretty much what we got, right? The Moon Knight Marvel Studios chose to adapt was the supernatural warrior Moon Knight, mythological Moon Knight, a Moon Knight there's plenty of comic book basis for. Evidently, some people were upset by this choice. They'd been hoping that when the MCU got around to adapting this character, it'd go for the vigilante, daredevil-y, Batman-y side. And look, that's reasonable, especially bearing in mind the type of stories the MCU's given us so far and the type it hasn't. Criticizing the show we got for not having the focus you hoped it would, though, less reasonable. But hey, maybe it's also the relative recency of that comic book basis that ticked people off. Maybe folks felt shortchanged because Feige, Slater, Diab and co. drew on the Moon Knight of Volume 8 rather than of the 80s. Maybe that's why we've seen fans give comments like this. When I first read that Moon Knight was going to change from crime fighting to fighting supernatural enemies, I thought you were making a grave mistake. Oh shoot, you know what, I mixed my notes up. That's actually a fan letter printed in response to Moon Knight issue 36, way back in 1984. It is true that this side of the character has, on balance, been emphasized more in recent years, but it has been present, has been fairly visible for yonks. So, capturing the whole scope of this character's various revisions and iterations, coming anywhere close with one season, 6 episodes, was never going to be remotely possible. But the show is drawing on the Moon Knight comics quite heavily, just primarily the more recent ones. Again, you can see a lot of Volume 8 here. It is far from a direct adaptation, but it isn't hard at all to see a great deal of direct influence. Take Mark's time stuck in a strangely Egyptian-tinged asylum, which seems to exist in multiple mental or metaphysical planes at once, populated by ghosts from his past. Take the fact that a major antagonist seems to be this asylum's head doctor, but is in reality a figure controlled by Amit. Take the battling godly avatars, or the general emphasis on Moon Knight as a vehicle for supernatural stories, as opposed to more stereotypical superheroic antics. Take that use of Mr. Knight as a battlesuit, the peripheral glances at a traumatic Jewish childhood, the generally fragile grip on reality, or take the specific moments, phrases, that made it in more or less verbatim.
Turns out going AWOL in a fugue state gets you discharged from the military.
Take all of that, hell, take any of that, and it becomes clear the show respects the source material, draws from it plenty. It's simply leaning on the more recent elements, aka exactly what Guardians of the Galaxy did. Shit, no, wait, actually, Guardians of the Galaxy changed a bunch more, and stuck even more loosely to the template laid out by the 2008 era print reboot, but that got a pass, and this didn't, because fewer people had read the Guardians comics, or seen panels posted online before that adaptation came out. And I know there's a bunch of people, 90% of whom I'm sure hadn't even heard of Drax, Yondu, or Star-Lord pre-2014, who'd say, nah, actually, we let the Guardians slide because that was good. And whatever, say that if you like, but if you're accepting that good is a separate thing to accurate, then you can't exactly turn around and criticize Moon Knight for diverting from the source material. Or you can, but picking up on differences has to be the starting point for a critique, not a critique in itself. And sure, plenty have approached Moon Knight like this, but plenty haven't. Gah! Alright, deep breath. Look, I could carry on with that whole comic book accuracy polemic I've reeled off a few times before about how it's overrated, unhelpful, and barely workable as a concept, but the kicker here is that in the grand scheme of superhero adaptations, it's fairly close, really. This is a super weird hill to die on, even within the MCU, and a lot of the things people point to in the show just don't support their argument. Layla is very clearly an update of Marlene, and that whole not killing Harrow thing, which drew a lot of ire, was widely supposed to be the result of Disney's maturity-blunting tampering, is a direct adaptation of, the same thing from the comics. The idea that Moon Knight was pretty accurate in some ways, less so in others, but that some of these divergences make a good deal of sense, in other words, that it's like most of these things, is boring. It makes for a worse hit tweet, a worse controversy-stoking takedown video, so maybe that's why it hasn't become the dominant fan narrative, but sometimes things are just boring. Like this section of the video, Jesus, can we move on already? No, one last thing. That thought we put a pin in like 40 minutes ago, the way this show's open-ended wrap-up is replete with reset potential, let's take that pin out. It is true that vast swathes of the Moon Knight mythos didn't make it into these 6 episodes, but the show also kept pretty much everything on the table. This time the focus was more supernatural, but there's absolutely no reason to imagine Mark, Steven, and Jake couldn't be faced with a more corporeal threat in their next appearance. As mentioned a while back, some leaks suggest Moon Knight's going to pop up on an Avengers team pretty soon, facing some decidedly non-mythological foes, and reflecting yet another facet of the long-running hero's comic book identity. But even ignoring this, there's really nothing stopping the bunch of creatives behind Moon Knight's next outing from going down the vigilante route, or even from grabbing a couple of F-list human criminal villains from the Moon Knight Rogues gallery, like Stained Glass Scarlet, Bushman again, the Committee, or the Black Spector. Why not? We saw Midnight Man here, after all. Sadly, Gaspar Ulliel passed away last year, so the return of Midnight Man is probably off the cards, but the appearance of his character does show that the MCU's clearly not afraid to introduce some of these odd villains. And speaking of wider Moon Knight canon, Midnight Man wasn't the only seed the show planted. We see Crawley in person, and we see that Frenchie exists, knows Mark. And Jeremy Slater, again the show's head writer, has been clear that these weren't meant to just be Easter eggs, little references crammed into the background. They'd had bigger roles in some script drafts. They'd tried to introduce Gina too. Ultimately, it hadn't made sense to properly feature those longtime Moon Knight supporting characters in this story, but they're not forgotten. They do exist. They can, and likely will, come into play. So there is an upside to this show, even if you despised everything it did with the character, the tone, and the world. Now we have a Moon Knight in the MCU, a great actor behind the role, and the potential to go anywhere with this. We have a series that's both its own thing, its own Moon Knight, and a springboard into a future Moon Knight, into any future Moon Knight, again and again. Now, the future's not certain, of course. Oscar Isaac could get tied up with other projects, plans might change, but at the very least, this show, this first 6 episodes, very consciously set the stage for a wider future. Anywhere is an option, and that was partially, at least, the point. So, maybe give the character at least 2 appearances before you die on the hill that he's been wasted. Maybe just let them cook. As we reach the end of this retrospective, Moon Knight's scales remain unbalanced, and it might seem that we're as far away from finding balance as we were an hour ago, and that all we've found here is more uncertainty, more ambiguity, and I wouldn't blame anyone for thinking this. Admittedly, the only thing that's clear, really clear at this point, after all of that, is that creating a Moon Knight series for Disney Plus set in the MCU that served as an introduction that appealed to Moon Knight purists, MCU fans, and newbies, while balancing the often outdated source material with a responsible, accurate, television-ready depiction of DID, as well as honoring the various, sometimes opposed ethno-religious dimensions and identities this character's stories traditionally included or adopted, and oh yeah, told an interesting story, and double oh yeah, was driven as much by the passion and vision of specific creatives as by the Marvel assembly line, that was always going to be a practically impossible task. Moon Knight conceptually has a lot going on, more than most. Ask any sausage maker what happens when you try and shove 60 kilos of meat into one casing, and you'll hear that stuff falls out. It can't all fit in. But that's why you've got a whole box of other casings. And at the end of the day, you're not gonna fit every part of the cow into the sausage aisle. Yeah, that's right, I made the metaphor kosher. I wouldn't blame anyone for thinking all we have here is ambiguity, but I don't. I think we can still balance these scales. We can't do it right away though, so even at this stage, I'm not going to pronounce any final verdicts. I'm not going to try and make any definitive value judgments on the show, on its storytelling, its themes, its representation, its cultural sensitivity. I can't tell you which of these two visions of Moon Knight is nearer reality, but I think we can start to uncover why there's such a divide here. Some people are viewing the show as the whole story, and some are viewing it as simply a first story. I think both of these perspectives make sense. On the one hand, as we've discussed, there are plenty of signs both within and outside of the text which suggest Moon Knight wants to be understood as an introduction, and on the other, reappearances and continuations be damned, individual projects should stand up on their own merits. What is the point of a franchise like this otherwise? I mean, I like the show as a standalone, so this isn't a problem for me, but for viewers who disliked what this project did, yeah, what the future might hold is kind of irrelevant. But that's really the key here, isn't it? Viewers who disliked what Moon Knight did. Notice I didn't say viewers who disliked what Moon Knight didn't do. There is a difference here. There's feeling mixed about the pacing, there's criticizing the handling of the Jake Lockley dissociations, there's feeling that Mark's shiver despair doesn't ring true or is insulting, and then there's being frustrated at what's essentially a miniseries for failing to adapt your favorite bits from decades worth of comics. And I understand why people feel that way, I do. I'll grant there's a richness and a fragile hardness to the character we've not really seen yet, that seeing him in some more grounded, more human conflicts would kick ass, but I can't put that on this show. That'd be like being upset at Batman Begins for not centering on the Joker. So come on, let's stay with the show we got, not the various imaginary ones we didn't, and let's save talk of wasted potential until we've seen more than 6 episodes, because it's just unfair and pretty dim really to hold those up against hundreds and hundreds of issues from different writers across different continuities and nearly 5 decades. And I know I keep coming back to that imbalance, but it really is the elephant in the room. Live action adaptations aren't the comics, they're not supposed to be, and they can't be. And realizing this, accepting it, is how we proceed. Because in letting go of these misplaced expectations, a weight is lifted. The scales finally reach balance, because we've taken off something that had been pressing down, that we'd put onto them ourselves, and that was never supposed to be there in the first place. Moon Knight becomes one show once more. A show that's good or mid or bad depending on your perspective, depending on what you focus on, but one we can all look at, talk about together. Thanks for watching. As I alluded to a couple of times, I have made some videos on this show before while it was airing, and in case you're curious about those, I'll link a playlist of them in the description below. But again, they're from shitty mic / missing tooth, bad sound quality era, so you've been warned. If you've made it this far, I guess I wouldn't say no to a like. This video's taken the best part of a month to put together after all, and if you want to help this channel become a place where I can take a while to work on longer videos without going full Stephen Grant about line going down in the meantime, consider supporting me on Patreon for as little as £2 a month. That's what all these legends on screen now are doing, so huge thanks to them, especially Daniel Goldhorn, Heather Long, Ryan Emily, and Weirdy Beardy. And I'll see you all next time for a shorter video.